Okay, so I was asked to work on a few reports for Solidarity Against Neoliberal Extremism about Glasgow and about neoliberalism in Glasgow, and these are the three reports here. The first one, Glasgow's Money, looks in is a kind of critical assessment of how the financial model in Glasgow works, especially Glasgow City Council, the debt, austerity, all those sorts of things. Glasgow Strife, the second one, was looking specifically at the closure of community facilities in Glasgow, libraries, community centres. This year, after the pandemic, they remain closed, and it was looking at why they remain closed. And then the third one, Glasgow's Alchemy, was looking at the recovery strategy, the economic recovery strategy of the city council, especially in Glasgow after the pandemic, and why, you know, they basically stuck to a kind of business as usual neoliberal model of economic development after the pandemic. So the idea behind these reports was to kind of look at and try to understand how neoliberalism actually works in practice as a way to obviously try to change it. You know, so we don't understand what's going on, we can't change it. And these are some of the questions that we tried to explore in the reports. And I think it's important to say that these reports are only a starting point. You know, they're a snapshot of the situation, and you know, it's a collective project to build up the knowledge and understanding to build on these as a starting point. So before I get into the meat of the presentation, I think it's important to set it in its proper context, which is that nothing I'm going to say tonight, or not much I'm going to say tonight, is very different from what's happening in other cities in Scotland, and other cities in the UK, and indeed in Europe and the world. The neoliberal city is a common feature worldwide. These are some of the books that I've been reading about the neoliberal city that I'd recommend. And these are the sort of things that you can find in all these places, you know, and are quite typical of the neoliberal city. And I would argue that all of these, to one extent or another, are constituted within the Glasgow context. And hopefully this presentation, although I'm not going to be able to, in 15, 20 minutes, I'm not going to be able to show all of these aspects. Hopefully some of these aspects will come through in this presentation. So the first thing I want to talk about is austerity, which is the kind of obvious starting point, and the kind of financial straitjacket that Glasgow City Council is in. And it's not only a problem of Glasgow City Council, it's a problem of Scottish Government, of national government, that basically has, especially over the past decade, has acted to put massive pressure on the delivery of public services, massive funding pressure. And there's different areas in which, you know, the problem of austerity exists, and over time makes it harder and harder to get out of that straitjacket. And these are the 6 different areas I'm going to look at. So the first thing is there's a kind of devolving of the axe. The money is cut from the UK government level to the Scottish government. Over the austerity era, local government has been disproportionately affected by cuts in Scotland. So the Scottish government has passed on more than the Scottish government's budget has been cut, but you know, the local government has suffered more cuts than the average in Scottish public services. And of course, it's passed then from local government down to social care workers and lower pay, cuts to community facilities and so on. And Glasgow in particular has suffered the most cuts per head of any council in Scotland, because it's grown quite significantly, its population has grown quite significantly. So per head between 2013 and 2020, there's been a £270 cut, whereas in Scotland on average has been a £160 cut. The next area of importance to consider is that there's an increasing amount of the local authorities' budget, which is called protected areas, as in the council can only spend the money on particular things that are already being dictated by the Scottish government, and that's ring fencing has been growing over recent years. So not only is the local council's budget getting smaller, but the amount of control they have to decide how to spend that budget is getting increasingly limited. So COSLA says that 58% of the council's budget is now ring fenced. And then finally, there's increasing costs. So education, and especially social work, the costs of social work are rising all the time. Education and social work now make up 71% of the council's budget. So councils have basically become institutions which largely are funding education and social work, and everything else is totally squeezed. Although in Glasgow's case, over recent years, social work has certainly been squeezed as well. But they are now the two main areas in which councils spend money. The debt. So Glasgow City Council has a debt of 1.5 billion, and half is due for repayment in the next 30 to 50 years. So there's still a significant debt. The ratio between the debt and the budget, the council's budget, has actually shrunk a bit. So the situation, over the last few years is not quite as bad as it was 5 or 6 years ago. But still, the council is paying off PFI debt that was accumulated due to in 2002, the PFI private consortium to build and repair 29 schools in Glasgow, 30 schools. That debt is still there. It's still, charging 8% interest every year, which is double the amount you pay for public borrowing. So that was a disastrous experiment in private finance, and the council's budget today is still struggling as a result of that. The other aspect of debt, which is important to recognise, is called LOBO debt, which is basically debt from commercial banks, which again is at very high rates of interest, much higher than public borrowing. Glasgow City Council now has the biggest LOBO debt of any council in the whole of the UK, and they'll be paying that off for many years to come. The ratio between the Glasgow City Council's debt and the amount of council tax revenue it brings in every year is 45%. So 45p in every pound of council tax goes towards paying off this debt. And other councils which have significant debt are looking to renegotiate it. For example, Newham Council has renegotiated its LOBO debt, but Glasgow has not pursued renegotiation of LOBO debt or of PFI debt. And you think that the PFI debt is held by this company here, John Lang, which is owned in a tax haven in Guernsey. So it pays no tax on the money we're giving it every year. It's quite shocking that no efforts are being made to do something about that outstanding debt. Finally, second to last is the local government tax system, which was created in the early 1990s to replace the hated poll tax, which is a council tax. And it's a terrible tax system. It's disproportionately goes on low incomes. It's now 30 years out of date. The valuations were done in 1991, when the difference in property wealth was something like 5 times between Band A and Band H taxpayers. Now it's over 15 times as much. But there's not been any change to the property valuations to reflect that. So it's an unfair tax, disproportionately hits those on lowest incomes. It doesn't raise enough money for local authorities to be self-sustaining, and there's been no effort to seriously reform that tax by the Scottish government. So that's a major problem in terms of trying to raise money to sustainably pay for public services. The other aspect, which I'm not going to go into lots now, is non-domestic rates, which is the business rates tax that local governments collect. There's lots of problems with that as well. But the biggest problem right now is that the amount they're collecting from businesses is collapsing. If you look at that table at the bottom there, you can see that business rates now take in less than council tax revenue. So we're taxing businesses much less than we're taxing people in Glasgow. So that's a major problem, and often major companies often don't pay any business rates in Glasgow because they'll just sell their products in Glasgow, whereas business rates are levied on the rentable value of the property. So that's another tax that needs reformed, and it's problematic. The final bit is there's no strategy within the council to raise revenue through public investment. This isn't even considered anymore as part of what a council would do, really, is to use its land, use its assets to invest, in industrial policy, to invest in things that are, great quality jobs that are good for the area and bringing revenue. And this is just an example of, there is a nearby example of Lothian Buses, which is majority owned by Edinburgh Council and 2 other councils in the Lothians, which is a successful model of a local publicly owned firm. Okay, the second aspect I'm going to look at is neoliberal development strategy, and this report, Glasgow's Alchemy, and there's 4 aspects to this. And basically the point is that the council has pursued a strategy, despite all the talk of build back better, we're going to do things differently after the pandemic, and so on and so forth. If you look at the documents that the council's produced about its strategy after the pandemic, it's really business as usual. And what is business as usual? Business as usual is basically whatever gets corporations into the city, we'll support. We'll put subsidies towards it, we'll provide incentives, we'll market ourselves in a way which attracts big businesses into the city. As well as that, when we build public infrastructure, we'll build it in partnership with the private sector, and we'll build it around what the private sector needs. So that is basically business as usual when it comes to regional development policy. And it creates a race to the bottom between different councils because they're all competing with each other to attract businesses. The language that they use in Glasgow City Council is called the Glasgow narrative, and this is their glossy, much more glossy PowerPoint than this one, in which they advertise and promote the city to potential investors, and they say things in this presentation like Glasgow is comfortable with risk and experimentation. All this kind of language to attract people. The main organisation which heads up this work is called Invest Glasgow, which is the inward investment, the quote unquote inward investment team. The other organisation is called IFSD Glasgow, which is specifically about the financial district within Glasgow. And these are part of Glasgow City Council. They contribute to the budget of Glasgow City Council. And here you see the things that they offer to potential businesses to come to the city, a whole range of free services, incentives and subsidies. And just pick a few of these out from here. They're talking about how they look at the lowest corporation tax. They talk about tax incentives, including Patent Box. Now, Patent Box was developed in the Republic of Ireland and has been criticised by the EU and the OECD as a tax evasion, as a tax avoidance mechanism. So this is the ways in which Glasgow City Council is promoting itself to potential businesses to try and get them to come here. The most important grant to attract businesses has been called the Regional Selective Assistance Grant of Scottish Enterprise. And as part of this report, we did a Freedom of Information request to Scottish Enterprise. And basically, somewhere in the region of 80 million has been spent to attract businesses to locate to Glasgow. And remember, there's no commitments put on these businesses in terms of jobs creation, in terms of the quality of jobs they will create, in terms of the sustainability of those jobs. Like, if they decide to automate those jobs in the future, or if they decide to leave Glasgow in the future because there's an economic crisis, there's no commitments made when you're doing this race to the bottom approach. It's just pay money to attract big businesses. Now, one of the new projects that's being taken forward is called Clyde Mission. And Clyde Mission is not only Glasgow City Council, it's Glasgow City Council, the Scottish Government, and really the UK government, because it's tied in with the City Deal, what's called the City Deal funding for infrastructure. And this is part of the wider Glasgow region, which includes 8 councils. Now, one of the important things to say about that is that, typical of the neoliberal approach is to create structures which are, there's very little democratic accountability. And these new structures, City Deal, Glasgow, the new broader Glasgow region, including 8 councils, how does a citizen have any say over the decisions that are made by these organisations? Do citizens even know about these organisations? They usually don't. So Clyde Mission is a regeneration project, but it's really about public-private partnerships. And the Scottish Government's pitch, when you go on the Scottish Government website to read about Clyde Mission, it says, we're developing an investor prospectus to attract businesses. So it's all that same inward investment lingo. And this image here is of, actually it's not in Glasgow, it's in the mouth of the Clyde in the boat in Western Bartonshire. It's called the Exxon City Deal project, and it's basically a project to take what was an Exxon Mobil oil site in Bowling and redo the site, and it's going to cost 34 million to do up this site. Now Exxon paid the council 1 million to take over the site, so it's a pretty good deal for Exxon Mobil, and one of the biggest oil firms in the world, whereby they pay 1 million and the public purse pays 34 million to clean up the site for reinvestment. That's just that is only one example. There's lots of different examples of these sort of projects that are taking place. Green ports. Now, the Glasgow City Council has said it would like to pursue this idea of a green port in Glasgow. What are green ports? Green ports are basically a spin on the Tory Brexiteer idea. The Tories are talking about free ports, setting up free ports, which are basically zones, economic zones, which there's no tax liability or customs liability. So they are what journalist and economist George Kevin has called them neoliberalism on steroids. And basically it's, can we attract businesses to this port, whether it's an airport or a port for boats, and get them to set up there. We won't ask them to pay any tax, any customs, and that will attract more investment. It's a pretty crazy idea, because what you're then going to do is you're then going to have is a race to the bottom, whereby businesses located elsewhere will decide, well, I want to go to the free port. So if you're a local authority and you don't have a free port, you're going to have to put forward new incentives, new subsidies to keep businesses in your area. So it just pulls the whole thing down in terms of regulations, in terms of tax. And so what is it? The Scottish Government's spin on this is that it will be the same as a free port, except that there'll be fair work commitments and net zero commitments. Now, if you look at the detail of what a green port would look like in Glasgow City Council, where almost certainly the green port would be based around Glasgow Airport. That's their idea for where a green port would be, because they've already invested massively in a Glasgow investment area. This is the Glasgow investment area, which is near Glasgow Airport, which is one of their City Deal projects. How could an airport be a green port? It doesn't make any sense. And the owner of Glasgow Airport, AGS Airports, also owns the airport in Southampton, owns the airport in Aberdeen. So it's a ridiculous idea. It's an idea that probably won't even happen anyway, because they need the UK government's support for green ports for them to happen, and the UK government show no indication it's interested in taking up this idea. So it's a non-starter, and it's a very bad idea anyway. Transformational regeneration areas. This is Glasgow City Council's approach to housing development in the area. You can see in that map there the different, I think it's 8 transformational regeneration areas. and 600 of those are going to be going towards social housing. 6,500 are for affordable sale, mid-market rent. So just 10% of this huge public investment in the Glasgow City Council are going to be made, the Glasgow City Council are going to make in this project, are going to go towards public assets. The rest are going to be, mid-market rent, private asset, or affordable sale, which is basically, you can get a mortgage at a low price, but then the mortgage will probably go up in price afterwards, and they'll sell it on the private market. One particular development, Sight Hill, which you can see in the picture here, is the biggest housing development currently outside of London. It's going to cost 250 million public monies going into this Sight Hill development. 628 houses are for private sale, 198 for mid-market rent, and 141 social housing. So you can see the priorities there. And if you think about an area like Sight Hill, it's not the right word, it's experienced 3 demolitions within the past decade of public housing. And previously there was 2,500 council houses and social houses in that area. So you think about that, Sight Hill previously said 2,500 council houses is going to be left with 141 social houses. So that's a major gentrification, displacement, privatisation, whatever you want to call it, project there that's going to push people. It's going to turn Sight Hill into a more wealthy area and push the people who previously lived there further out to the fringes of the city. A typical gentrification project. Okay, the final last thing I'm going to talk about is the Glasgow Life closures of community facilities, this Glasgow Strife report that we did back in June. So it's in June, so maybe some of the information is a little dated now, but hopefully it's still relevant enough. So if you don't know the background, I'll just explain briefly the background. Lots of Glasgow Life facilities were closed during the pandemic for health and safety reasons. But then once the lockdown ended, many of those facilities never reopened. They never opened because the council said they didn't have the money to reopen them, or specifically Glasgow Life didn't have the money to reopen them. So rather than finding money, what they did was they set up something called People Make Glasgow Communities, which is a scheme. Basically, I believe it's a scheme basically for offloading council assets onto community groups or even onto commercial developers. Because if you look at the website, it's got this map here of all of council assets, land, council property, all of the council area. And it basically says, come and tell us what you would do with this if you were to take it over. So it's a public call for anyone to say what they would do with it if they took it over. And to quote the website, it says any organisation, community group, or commercial organisation can apply. So you can see this isn't just about community groups; it's much wider than that. You can actually search for properties all over the city. So it's not just about if you want to take over something in your local area. It's quite clearly that it's much broader than that. So out of 62 closed venues, the closed Glasgow Life venues, 2 have already been community asset transfers, 2 there's community asset transfer requests, 17 are earmarked for community management through the People Make Glasgow Communities scheme, and 22 there's interest in exploring new operating models for those libraries, community centres, and so on and so forth. And obviously there's been a campaign in Glasgow against those closures. Now, the council would argue that what they're just trying to do is empower communities, and they've got no other interest in it, and that anyway all this is just because of the pandemic. They don't want to be doing any of this. Actually, if you look back at the council's property and land strategy, which the council agreed to in 2019, signed off on in 2019, in April 2019, you can see that really what they're doing now with People Make Glasgow Communities is just a sort of intensification of what they've already been planning. So this property and land strategy says that there's a surplus of property and land, council property and land, and their focus is on delivering services from a reduced number of locations, enabling the council to, quote, reduce its operating costs, realise capital receipts, and invest in fewer high-quality facilities, which is, again, a typical neoliberal strategy. Council land all over the UK has been sold off on a massive scale over the last decade because they want to get rid of local community facilities, focus themselves on commercial assets, big ticket things like the SSE Hydro, which they think can attract in tourism, and that will be the way in which they develop the city. So the aim is to create a smaller, more agile council state with the sale of land contributing to, quote, a potential unlocking of regeneration and redevelopment opportunities for the private sector. So you can see what the this is a land privatization, a land disposal, land and asset disposal strategy that they're really pursuing here, and it's again very typical of a neoliberal approach to the city. The social impact of these cuts. So in the report, what we did was we mapped onto the social and the multiple index of social deprivation, Scottish multiple index of social deprivation, which shows the 20% most deprived areas in Scotland, this map, and the blue dots are where the closures are to these facilities. And a significant, I think something like half of the facilities are in the 20% most deprived areas. 31 venues, so 31 venues out of 62, so exactly half. 19 are in the 10% most deprived. The council's own equality impact assessment of these closures said there's potential for an impact for service users of displacement. There was potentially a breach of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and on Article 27 of the UN Convention, which is about the right to fully participate in the cultural life of the community. So obviously these closures hit the poorest hardest. I think there's absolutely no doubt about that, and potentially 700 jobs will be lost as well. Council jobs will be lost as a result of it. The final thing to say about this is that, of course, Glasgow Life is an arm's length organisation, which are called ALIOs, and Glasgow City Council has the most ALIOs of any council in Scotland, and 25% of council spending goes for these ALIOs. And part of the politics around these closures has been whose responsibility is it? Is it Glasgow Life? Is it Glasgow City Council? Who's really to blame and all this sort of stuff? It creates a lack of democratic accountability again when you divide up the council into these separate entities, and these ALIOs were created back. Most of them were created in the mid-2000s by when Labour were in control of the council, a time when it was really all about how do you make councils more commercialised, how do you make more streamlined operations, and they don't add much. There's no proof that they add anything in terms of public service delivery. But what they do is they add costs, because all these ALIOs have senior management teams on very high-paying salaries. They increase the commercialisation of the council and reduce democracy. So it's important to understand that what's going on the ground with these closures is part of a long-running neoliberal restructuring of Glasgow City Council. Is there an alternative to all of this? Yes, there is. In the reports, we put forward a number of different proposals. These are just some of them for how we could do things differently and build an approach which is based on public investment in public services, which is based on creating more equality within the council, more equality in terms of redistributing wealth within Glasgow. More democracy in terms of how the council's run, taking on the banks in terms of renegotiation and debt cancellation. Just to pick out a couple of these, the Preston models, maybe some people have heard of this. It's been much talked about. Preston Council basically decided that rather than for the public procurement spending, rather than spending it on corporations, they spend it on local businesses and cooperatives. And they encourage cooperatives to apply for local procurement. So a way of keeping the wealth within the local area, rather than just giving it to big businesses when all the money will be sucked out of the local area. Another one to mention, I haven't talked about in this talk, is wage ratios, because it's important to say there's a big pay inequality within the council as well. The number of senior staff in the council within the ALIOs that earn six-figure salaries, I think it's something like 13 members of senior staff earn six-figure salaries now. So about reducing inequality within the council as well, wider public policies to reduce inequality within the area, rent controls, public land value capture, that when you are doing public developments, you don't pay market value, you pay the use value of the land, to reduce the costs of land in public development. And the thing at the bottom isn't a policy, but it's the approach of solidarity against neoliberal extremism, which is to build a people's plan for the city, where citizens lead a democratic renewal of the city, which thinks about, how do you get to net zero very quickly in the city? How do you transform the city based on, the principles of equality and public participation? And that would be a completely new approach to the kind of top-down approach to neoliberal approach that we've seen so far. So I hope that was a useful overview of the three reports. Thanks very much for listening.